When I was a little girl, I believed love could last forever. My grandparents gave me that belief. Every summer I stayed at their small house in the countryside. The house was old. The paint on the walls was fading. The furniture was simple, but the place always felt warm. Every morning my grandfather made tea for my grandmother. Every evening they sat together outside the house and watched the sunset. Sometimes they didn't talk much, but they always sat side by side. As a child, I thought that was what love looked like. Quiet, simple, forever. My grandmother passed away when I was 16. I remember the day of her funeral. My grandfather stood beside her photo and held her favorite scarf in his hands. He did not cry, at least not in front of us. That night I walked past his room. The door was slightly open. I saw him sitting alone on the edge of the bed. He was holding an old photo of them together. I saw him cry, not loudly, just quietly, like a man whose heart had lost its home. That image stayed with me for years. It made me believe that real love existed. And one day I thought I had found it. His name was Daniel. I met him when I was 24. He was kind, funny, and easy to talk to. Our first date lasted 5 hours. We talked about movies, family, dreams, and places we wanted to visit. When I got home that night, my cheeks hurt from smiling. 3 years later, he asked me to marry him. I said yes before he could even finish the question. I felt lucky. I felt chosen. I felt loved. We rented an apartment together. We planned our wedding. We argued about small things, like flower colors and music. But I thought that was normal. Every couple argued sometimes. At least, that was what I believed. Then, 6 months before our wedding, everything changed. One evening, Daniel was in the shower. His phone lit up on the table. I was not trying to check his messages. I simply saw a name I did not recognize. Then I saw the words, "I miss you already." My stomach tightened. My hands became cold. I told myself there had to be an explanation. There had to be. But deep inside, I already knew. The truth came out a few days later. He had been seeing another woman. For almost a year. I still remember sitting across from him in our living room. The room was silent. The air felt heavy. I looked at the man I planned to marry. The man I trusted. The man I loved. And suddenly he felt like a stranger. "I'm sorry," he said. That was all. Just 3 words. 3 words after 3 years together. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask why. Instead, I simply nodded. Because sometimes pain is too big for words. The wedding was cancelled. Friends stopped asking questions after they saw my face. I moved out of our apartment. I packed photos, gifts, and memories into cardboard boxes. One rainy night, I sat alone in my new apartment. The walls were empty. The rooms were quiet. My phone rang. It was my best friend, Sarah. After a few minutes of silence, she asked softly, "Do you still believe in love?" I looked out the window. Rain ran down the glass. The city lights looked blurry. For a long time, I said nothing. Then I shook my head. No. At that moment, I truly meant it. I believed love was just a beautiful story people told themselves. I believed people always left. I believed forever was not real. What I did not know was this. A few years later, a stranger sitting on a park bench would completely change my mind. 3 years passed after my cancelled wedding. On the outside, my life looked fine. I had a good job. I paid my bills on time. I met friends on weekends. I smiled when people talked to me. But inside, something was missing. I no longer trusted love. Whenever someone tried to set me up on a date, I found an excuse. "I'm too busy. I'm focusing on work. Maybe next time." Those were the answers I always gave. The truth was much simpler. I was afraid. I was afraid of being hurt again. So I built a wall around my heart. And I stayed behind it. Every weekday, I spent my lunch break in a small park near my office. The park was not special. There were a few trees, a walking path, some flower beds, and several old wooden benches. I liked the place because it was quiet. Most people were busy. Nobody asked questions. Nobody talked about relationships. I could simply sit there and breathe. That was where I first noticed him. An old man. He always sat on the same bench. Every day, no matter the weather. Sunny days, cloudy days, even rainy days. He was there. At first I did not pay much attention, but after several months I became curious. One afternoon I arrived later than usual. The bench beside him was empty. I bought a sandwich and sat down. For a few minutes neither of us spoke. Then I smiled politely. "Nice weather today." The old man chuckled. "It was raining this morning." I laughed. "You're right." That small conversation became another one the next day, and another the day after that. Soon we started talking regularly. His name was Henry. He was 78 years old. He liked tea more than coffee. He fed birds whenever he visited the park. And he told terrible jokes, really terrible jokes. One day he pointed at two pigeons fighting over a piece of bread. "They remind me of married couples." I laughed despite myself. "That's not very romantic." "Real marriage is not always romantic," he replied with a grin. That answer stayed in my mind. One afternoon, after several weeks of talking, I finally asked the question that had been bothering me. "Why do you come here every day?" Henry looked ahead. His smile became softer. Then he gently patted the empty space beside him. "My wife sits here." I turned toward the bench. It was empty. No one was there. For a moment, I thought I had heard him wrong. Henry noticed my confusion. He looked at the empty seat again. Then he spoke quietly. "My wife passed away 12 years ago." The sounds of the park suddenly felt far away. Children were playing nearby. Birds were singing in the trees. But everything seemed quieter. I did not know what to say. "I'm sorry," I finally whispered. Henry nodded. "Thank you." His voice was calm. There was sadness in it, but there was also peace. I looked at him carefully. "You still come here every day?" "Almost every day." 12 years? Yes. The answer surprised me. I could not imagine missing someone for 12 years. I could not imagine loving someone for that long. Part of me wanted to understand. Another part wanted to run away from the topic completely, because every conversation about love reminded me of my own past. After a moment I asked, "Were you two married for a long time?" Henry smiled. His eyes became brighter. "Oh, yes." He laughed softly. "Long enough to annoy each other for more than 50 years." I found myself laughing with him. For the first time in a very long while, a conversation about love did not make me feel angry. It made me curious. As we sat together on that old bench, I realized something. Henry was not visiting the park because he could not let go. He was visiting because something still connected him to this place, to that bench, to those memories. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know who his wife was. I wanted to know why he kept coming back. Most of all, I wanted to know if a love like that could really exist. Because if it could, then maybe I had been wrong about love all along. After that conversation, I became even more curious about Henry and his wife. Every day during lunch, I sat beside him on the same bench. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes. Sometimes we talked for an hour. The more stories he shared, the more I realized something surprising. His marriage was not perfect, not even close. One sunny afternoon I asked him, "What was your wife like?" Henry smiled immediately, the kind of smile that appears when someone thinks about a favorite memory. "She was stubborn." I blinked. "That's the first thing you thought of?" "Absolutely." He laughed. "She always wanted the last word." I laughed too. "You don't sound very romantic." "Wait until you hear the rest." For the next few minutes, Henry told me story after story. His wife, Margaret, loved books. She loved flowers. She loved old movies. And according to Henry, she was always right. Or at least she believed she was. "Did you two ever fight?" I asked. Henry looked at me as if I had asked the world's easiest question. "Every married couple fights. Even happy couples. Especially happy couples." That answer surprised me. For years, I had believed that strong relationships meant fewer problems. But Henry seemed to believe the opposite. "We argued about money," he said. "We argued about our children. We argued about where to spend holidays." He paused and smiled. "Once we didn't speak to each other for 3 days because of a broken lamp." "A lamp?" "Yes." I laughed so hard that people nearby looked at us. Then Henry laughed too. For a moment, he looked 20 years younger. When the laughter faded, his voice became softer. "There were difficult years." I listened quietly. "When we first got married, we had very little money." He pointed toward his shoes. "I wore the same pair for almost 4 years." "Really? Really?" Margaret worked 2 jobs. Henry worked long hours at a factory. Sometimes they worried about rent. Sometimes they worried about food. Life was not easy. Yet when he talked about those years, there was no bitterness in his voice, only gratitude. "How did you stay together?" I asked. Henry looked at the trees above us. The leaves moved gently in the wind. Then he answered, "Every night we chose each other again." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He thought for a moment. "Love is not one big decision. It's thousands of small decisions." I stayed silent. He continued. "Some days I was tired. Some days she was angry. Some days life felt unfair. But every night we decided to stay on the same team." Those words settled deep inside me. I thought about Daniel. I thought about our broken engagement. I thought about all the pain I had carried for years. Part of me wanted to reject Henry's ideas. It felt safer that way. But another part of me could not ignore what I was hearing. This old man had lived through problems far bigger than mine. Yet he still believed in love. A few days later, I asked a question that had been on my mind for a long time. "Do you still miss her?" The moment the words left my mouth, I worried they might be too personal. But Henry did not seem offended. Instead, he looked at the empty seat beside him. His eyes became distant, as if he could see someone I could not. "Every day," he said quietly. The answer broke my heart. 12 years, and still every day. "Doesn't it hurt?" I asked. Henry nodded slowly. "Of course it hurts." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The park was peaceful. A dog ran across the grass. Children laughed near the fountain. Life continued all around us. Then Henry said something I would never forget. "Love always hurts when it is real." I looked at him. He was not crying. He was not angry. He was simply telling the truth. "The pain never completely leaves," he continued, "but neither does the love." His eyes remained fixed on the empty seat. "People think grief and love are opposites." He shook his head gently. "They are connected. The grief exists because the love existed first." I felt something tighten in my chest. For years, I had treated pain as proof that love was a mistake. Henry saw it differently. To him, pain was proof that love had mattered. That afternoon after we said goodbye, I walked back to my office alone. The city looked the same. The streets were the same. The people were the same. But my thoughts were changing. For the first time since my broken engagement, I found myself wondering if I had been asking the wrong question. Maybe the question was not, can love last forever? Maybe the real question was, if love changes your heart forever, does it ever truly end? I did not know the answer. For the next few months, seeing Henry became part of my daily routine. Every weekday, I walked to the park during lunch, and every weekday he was there, sitting on the same bench, watching the birds, telling bad jokes, sharing small stories about Margaret. Sometimes he talked about the first time they met. Sometimes he talked about family vacations. Sometimes he simply sat quietly and enjoyed the afternoon sun. Those moments became important to me, more important than I realized. Then one rainy Monday, Henry was not there. At first I did not think much about it. The weather was terrible. Rain fell from dark grey clouds. The paths were wet. Most of the benches were empty. I told myself he was probably staying home. But on Tuesday, he was not there either, or Wednesday, or Thursday. Each day I looked toward the bench before I even realized I was doing it, and each day it remained empty. By Friday, I felt uneasy. The empty bench no longer looked normal. It looked wrong. That afternoon, I finally spoke to one of the park workers, an older woman who often cleaned the walking paths. "Excuse me," I asked. "Do you know the gentleman who usually sits on that bench?" She nodded immediately. "Henry?" "Yes." Her expression softened. "He hasn't been here because he's in the hospital." The words hit me harder than I expected. "The hospital?" She nodded. "I heard he became ill last week." For a moment I simply stood there. I was surprised by how worried I felt. Henry was not family. We had only known each other for several months. Yet the thought of losing him filled me with fear. The park worker gave me the name of the hospital. That evening, after work, I went there. The hospital room was quiet. The sound of machines filled the air. When I entered, Henry looked smaller than I remembered. Weaker, too. But when he saw me, he smiled. "Well," he said softly, "I was wondering when you'd show up." I laughed, though my eyes were already filling with tears. "You disappeared." "I know. You scared me." Henry smiled again. "I didn't mean to." For a while we talked about ordinary things, the weather, the park, the birds he liked to feed, almost as if nothing had changed. But eventually the room grew quiet. Henry looked toward the window. The evening sky was turning orange. Then he reached toward the drawer beside his bed. From inside, he pulled out an old envelope. The paper looked worn. The corners were bent. It was clear that he had kept it for many years. He held it carefully before handing it to me. "What is this?" I asked. "A letter." I looked down at it. The handwriting on the front was neat and elegant. It was Margaret's. My heart tightened. Henry looked at me. "When I'm gone, I want you to read it." I immediately shook my head. "Don't say that." But Henry simply smiled. Not a sad smile, a peaceful one. "We all leave someday." His voice was calm. "There is nothing scary about that." Tears burned in my eyes. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he would be fine. But deep down, I knew he understood his situation better than I did. So I took the envelope and carefully placed it in my bag. A week later, I received a phone call. Before I even answered, I knew. Somehow, I knew. The park worker's voice sounded gentle. Henry had passed away peacefully during the night. I thanked her. Then I sat alone in my apartment. The room felt unbearably quiet. For a long time I stared at the envelope on my table. I was not ready to open it. Not yet. It felt like opening a door that could never be closed again. But eventually I picked it up. My hands trembled slightly. I unfolded the letter. The paper was old. The ink had faded, yet every word remained clear. The letter was written many years earlier. Margaret had written it after learning that she was seriously ill. Most of the letter was private. It was full of memories, small jokes, stories from their life together. But near the end, one paragraph caught my attention. I read it once, then again, and then a third time. Tears rolled down my face. The words said, "If one day I leave first, please keep living. Please keep laughing. Please keep visiting the places we love. Love does not end when a heartbeat stops. It stays in every life we touch." I could no longer hold back my tears. I cried harder than I had cried in years. Because suddenly I understood something. Henry had not been sitting on that bench for 12 years because he was trapped in the past. He had been living with love, carrying it forward, keeping it alive. The bench, the stories, the birds, the memories. They were not signs of loss. They were signs of love. And as I sat there holding Margaret's letter, I felt something inside me begin to change. The wall around it started to crack. For several weeks after Henry's funeral, I stayed away from the park. I told myself I was busy. Work was demanding, life was moving forward. But deep down, I knew the real reason. The park reminded me of Henry. And thinking about Henry reminded me of Margaret. Their story had changed something inside me. Yet I was not ready to face it. So I avoided the place. I avoided the bench. I avoided the feelings that came with it. But one Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun was shining through my window. The sky was clear. And for some reason, I found myself thinking about Henry's letter again, especially one sentence. Love does not end when a heartbeat stops. I sat quietly for a few minutes. Then I got dressed and left my apartment. An hour later, I was standing at the entrance of the park. Everything looked familiar. The trees, the walking paths, the flower beds, the small fountain near the center. Life continued exactly as it always had. Children were playing. People were walking their dogs. Birds were searching for food. And there, beneath the old tree, was the bench. Henry's bench. For a moment, I simply stood there. Then I slowly walked toward it. The seat beside me was empty, just as it had been every day for 12 years. I sat down and looked around. The air felt warm. A gentle breeze moved through the leaves above me. And suddenly I could almost hear Henry laughing beside me, telling one of his terrible jokes. I smiled. Then I laughed softly to myself. A few months ago, that bench had seemed sad. Now it felt different. Now it felt full of memories, full of gratitude, full of love. As I sat there, I thought about my own life. For years, I had believed that my broken engagement proved love was not real. I had allowed one painful experience to define everything. I built walls. I stopped trusting people. I stopped believing in possibilities. I stopped believing in love itself. But Henry and Margaret had shown me something important. Love was never a promise that people would stay forever. Life does not work that way. People leave. People change. Sometimes relationships end. Sometimes hearts break. Sometimes we lose the people we love most. But that does not make the love meaningless. In fact, it may make it even more valuable. I looked toward the empty seat beside me. For the first time, I understood what Henry had been trying to teach me. He was not holding on to the past. He was carrying love into the future. The love he shared with Margaret still lived in his stories, in his kindness, in the way he smiled when he spoke about her. And now, somehow, that love had reached me too. At that moment, my phone rang. It was my friend Sarah, the same friend who had called me years ago on that rainy night. I answered with a smile. We talked for a few minutes. Then she suddenly asked, "So, tell me something." "What? Do you believe in love now?" I looked up at the bright blue sky. The question made me smile. Years ago, my answer had been easy. Back then, I had said no. Now my answer was different. "Yes," I said quietly. There was a short silence. Then Sarah laughed. "Really? Really? What changed?" I looked at the empty bench one last time. Then I answered, "I learned that love doesn't last forever because people stay forever." I paused. The wind moved gently through the trees. Then I finished. It lasts forever because it changes us forever. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Sarah softly said, "I like that." "So do I." After we ended the call, I remained on the bench a little longer. The afternoon sun warmed my face. My heart felt light, not because life was perfect, not because pain had disappeared, but because I finally understood something. Love had never left my life. I had simply been looking for it in the wrong place. And as I stood up and began walking home, I felt ready for whatever came next. Because some people leave, some stories end, but real love leaves a mark that time cannot erase. And maybe that is what forever truly means.